Right, let's get my tea. Taking a look at the Campaigns of King David. This is a Clash of Arms game. It's one of those games that I can really picture playing this back with my old gaming groups, where I would have played it solitaire and kind of worked out the modifications and then presented it as such to them, and they would have loved it. And I wouldn't, because, well, I'd have a good time with it, there's no question there, but I enjoy playing games. I might have a better time with this, though, than I do with maybe some heavier games that I like as well. The big difference here, though, is that I don't hold this in a whole lot of respect. It's difficult for me to give a good rating to one of these kind of lighter military conflict simulation type games that doesn't feel like it's very much simulation. And that's what this comes down to. It feels like I'm playing, rolling all these dice. It feels like I'm playing an Axis and Allies, and these are, by the way, the dice that came with the game. It feels like an Axis and Allies type of adventure where, I just don't feel like I've got all that much detail in terms of the military aspects that I'd like. I also don't have all that much detail in terms of the economic aspects or anything else. But somehow I don't know, when these games tie together all those factors and there's not a lot of richness in it, it feels flat to me, especially in the solo play. Now, I had a good time videoing it, there's no question there. I had a good time playing it. I probably would have a good time playing it all the time. But I don't hold a lot of respect for it, so it's probably going to get around a 6 here. Component-wise, the map is absolutely beautiful. You've seen it in the videos, but just the material, the weight of it, and the fact that it's Poochie isn't that big a deal because of the areas, rather than, a hex map on this kind of material, which really didn't work for the Battles of the Age of Reason, and I assume it's going to be the same problem for Labatt games. Player aid, useful. Wish there were 2 of them. Obviously, you can photocopy another one out. But, for me, it doesn't matter. But playing with 4 or 5 people, this would be kind of a pain in the butt. Especially if everybody's doing their economic phase at the same time, which they, of course, are. It would be useful to have those numbers available to you for the economics, for the maintenance, the random events also, so you don't have to kind of pass this around all the time. Then again, the random events covered in here is not really sufficient. You need to break out the rulebook in order to get them. And coming to the rulebook, yes, it's very, very loose and light. I like that. I like the fact that I felt perfectly free to modify the heck out of this game because, well, there are some decisions that were made in the rules that I don't find terribly impressive. There were also, notably the stacking, there were also, a number of places where there were ambiguities that I feel like I could make this story come more alive in terms of revolts, etc., by letting the troop revolts play out differently than I think they were intended to, but there's an ambiguity that allows me for a poor wording of the rules. Speaking of which, this thing is an absolute wonder. I've already gone into it, but it's a really, really well done historical booklet. Longer than the rules, I think. It's 12 pages. The rules are 12 pages. Better quality in terms of being glossy. I don't mind a glossy when I'm reading something like this. It's at least, not filled with all kinds of color and distractions. It's an amazing story, The Reign of David, I'm surprised there are so few games on it, given that. Counters, good, heavy quality. I don't know if the bags came with the game. I clip today. I doubt it. Most companies don't. I'm not going to pack the dice in with it. My box is a little beaten up. It was a used copy, although I don't think the game was played. I think the counters were unpunched. Flaws. These suckers. Man, I hate rolling lots of dice. I hate adding a lot. The game is filled with adding. Every combat, you're rolling all these dice, adding them to the units that are on the board or that are involved in the battle. It's just really a headache for me. Another one then, adding up the economics. You gotta count at the very least all the difference between what you started with and what you have. Sometimes it's better to just count the entire board presence that you have if you're not silly like I am and make mistakes. Another big one for a lot of people, it's a game where you can get knocked out of, as you saw. You can get knocked out fairly early. It's reasonably long game. I mean, a hugely long game that you get knocked out of, like, one that's going to take you years to play or something. That's not such a big deal. Yeah, it sucks that you won't be with your buddies on that night anymore, but you don't lose a hunk of a day that you committed to. With this, let's say you went to an all-day gaming event, 5 people, and you get knocked out early, within the first hour or so. This game's going to take 5 or 6 hours for the full campaign. I don't know if there's shorter scenarios. I don't know. Well, yes, you can tailor it. You can make the points less or whatever. You can also put those end game markers in. But let's say you're playing the full game and you get knocked out. Well, now what? It's going to be 4 or 5 hours before your buddies are free. Of course, you could disappear. A lot of times, that's what would happen with these games. If it's played in a situation where there are other games and gamers going on, that's no big deal at all. If you're at a convention where there's open gaming going on, or where we used to play a lot of times was Saturday gaming at the University of Buffalo, and there were enough things going on, you could find something else to amuse yourself with. But it is somewhat troublesome. I mean, I can see, for me it wouldn't be a big deal if I was at my house to sit back and have a pipe and kind of watch the game go and maybe have something to read and hang out with my friends. But for some people that's just not much fun at all. And I can definitely see that as a big negative to a game like this, where you might not be pulling it out a lot of times just because, hey, you don't really want to make this where people have to leave early. On the other hand, in that kind of situation, you can always put this kind of game at the end of your gaming schedule. Now, yeah, it's 5 or 6 hours. What are you talking about, man? No, I'm used to 12, 16-hour game days. So, this wouldn't be the only event. If it was the only event, no big deal. I'm leaving. Hey. And if it's the last event of the night, same issue. What about the sort of fun level of it? There's a lot of games like this. Not all of them as obnoxious in terms of the die rolling, although that's better when you're playing Opposed. Solitaire, that, and the counting and everything else becomes very irritating. But Opposed, not so big a deal. Everybody's doing it at the same time, or you've got, in the combats, you've got 2 people rolling off against each other, and you get to see it. I don't remember what I was going to say. Yeah. It definitely has those negatives, but in comparison to other games of this nature, for example, something like Britannia, which I'd say is along kind of the same lines, even if it's a different scale, but it's the same kind of simple, hey, roll a bunch of dice, see what happens. And that also suffers from some of these same factors, actually, because you've got to count your victory points all the time and all kind of stuff like that. But I was thinking more actually along the lines of something like Warlords China in Disarray, where it's got a fairly, simple system still, but it doesn't take that easy out of roll lots of dice, which is a tremendous, tremendous way of simulating at least how firepower works on the battlefield. It's not so clear that it makes as much sense in a battle like this. I'm not convinced that this system lends itself terribly well to ancient warfare at all. What you don't have is sort of the morale factor, and the larger side just has an advantage no matter what. And maybe, the stacking is supposed to somehow abstract that away or something. That's not really more troops that David has with him. It's just his morale. If he's there, all those troops that were spread out and were equally good as they are together are now. But I don't understand it. So yes, there are some real issues here with the conception and how it maps to the reality that really disturb the crap out of me. Those are the kind of things that when I sit down and play with a bunch of other people, I'm not so worried about. But when I'm playing it solo, yeah, it really gets me, and it will always be there gnawing at the back of my head. Even if I'm having a great time playing it and everybody else is, when it comes time to rate it, there's that, this just doesn't make sense. And that's one of the big problems with it. I will definitely point out the one huge bonus, big, awesome thing, and that is these phase counters. They are so cool. They present a solution to the multi-year game where the patterns of production and resupply and whatever kind of repositioning like you had in God Kings has happened, they supply the answer to all that. Even games that I really, really like and respect, like Europa Universalis, next, maybe not right away next, but next moderately sized thing. I might do something while I'm setting it up. I was trying to debate what that would be. At one point I was thinking Galactic Empire, Conquest of Galactic Empire, but no, that's not going to work. That's a little too big. That's along the size of this. I'm now thinking more something like Red November. But anyway, something like EU has that problem by having 5-year turns like this does. Every 5 years you have this production factor. Every 5 years ships have to go back to Europe. Doesn't make sense, right? It's even worse, though, when you're looking at something like the God Kings with its 25-year cycle and the armies really having to reposition in an extreme sort of way. In EU, usually it's this tiny movement that's happening, with the exception of explorers. And explorers tend to try to push their luck and make it back to Europe, at least during the repositioning phase. They have that option. So those counters and their randomizing effect on how the turn is going to proceed is a really brilliant step. And as far as I can tell, the designer indicates, oh yeah, this is the new neat thing in this game. You'll see it's a little different from all my other designs. Well, I'm worried that all his other designs are actually very much like this one. Roll a bunch of dice, add a lot of stuff together, really limited in economic system. And I'm likely to stay away from his other designs because all of that is just bland at best. I've seen a lot of games that I think do that better than this one does. But where he pointed out in particular that there were new things, that, and also then the event chips, which I think add some serious flavor to this game. I'm not sure I thoroughly agree with piles of event chips. First of all, they're kind of irritating because of the lookup factor. The events are only really fully described, and maybe not even there, in the rule book. The player aid card gives you a useful hint towards the future. A lot of them seem the same. So you have, you know, I don't know, a intervention by God, and then you have like God's something else, and this, that, and the other. Let's see what they are here. I don't have the shits in front of me. But, well, actually, the best place is here, because the rule book kind of has them spread among a lot of pages. They're all in one place, but it takes 3 pages to cover them all in the detail. But we got the names here. So we have Act of God, we have God's Intervention, Hand of Fate, Ark of the Lord, which only the Judah player can use, so it never came into play because somebody else was holding it. All those things kind of lead you to say, yo, and I can't remember which one's which. And then you've got the surprise and ambush. Okay, that's fairly easy to remember. Surprise is the attacker, ambush is the defender. That kind of makes sense. But then you have the vacillating forces, troop revolt, bribe, recruit prisoners, which is a little different. You know that's going to be after the battle. And on the other side, you have things like siege works and secret entrance, defensive stalwart. You're not entirely sure. It's hard to remember. You know, you've seen these before, but it's hard to remember exactly what they do, and you have to look them up in a lot of cases. Oh, hey, wait. What does God's pantyhose do again? I mean, it is really tough to remember which one's which. And actually, somebody had a handful of Act of God, but they're kind of weird. There, a player must re-roll the current round of combat. Now, is that just one player? I think so, because it says maybe played on self or other player. The new re-roll takes effect and is applied. Nobody played this. It's a, hey, this battle didn't go as I expected. I got a really bad roll, let's reverse that. let's make it happen again. I never played that. I had somebody who had a couple of them. I think the Philistines had a couple of them sitting in their hand. They just didn't play it because it was hard to remember too. Once you're in the heat of the battle and rolling all those dice, a lot of times you forget the events you have. And that's another factor. You have this big pile of them, and maybe you don't really remember which ones you want to use when. Probably a worse steal solitaire than it is actually opposed. Anyway, it's a simple, interesting game. I think it's probably a good deal of fun. More fun than it brings any historical insight or, real verisimilitude. But I'm not unhappy that I have it. I can certainly see if I ever have friends, this is something that probably would be a good afternoon's game. Cheers.